This paper will begin by introducing the personal experience of an Italian patient who in 1497 became ill, but then recovered. The cathedral canon of Orvieto, Ser Silvestro di Tommaso di Silvestro, suffered from the Great Pox, a disease which was known by a series of names, including the French disease and the Mal de Naples. This was the decade when the disease began and spread through southern and northern Europe. The description of Ser Tommaso's illness is contained in his chronicle of his native city of Orvieto in the late 1490s, in which he recorded a number of natural disasters, including the beginnings of the French disease, as well as plague and famine. And I quote, "There came to me certain pains, first in the knees on the feast days of Christmas 1496, and then from January I declined rapidly, and I took the treatment of 5 syrups and a course of pills. Finally, a while after taking the pills, I suffered from certain pains on the top of my shoulder and in the kidneys and buttocks, and this lasted till May. Then a year later, on the 26th of April, 1498, his symptoms returned with greater ferocity. On my return from the fair at Foligno, my rod began to pain me, and from then the sickness increased every day afterwards. From then until the 8th of June, I began to have the pains of the French disease, and I felt a burning sensation all over my head with scabs that burned, and I felt pains in my right and left arms, all the way from the shoulders to the knuckles. It created such pain in my bones that I couldn't find rest. Then I had a pain in my right knee, and then boils erupted all over the front and back of my torso. And then after the Feast of Corpus Christi, I was treated with medicines and bloodletting, and then ointments for the pains and boils applied by Friar Olivieri, who was staying at Benano. I remained 6 days continually in bed, and at the end of the 7th, the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, the last day of June, I bathed myself with a hot fermentation of wine and many herbs, including bitter rue, mint, rosemary, laurel, garden sage, and other herbs. And on Sunday, I began to go out of the house, that is the 1st of July. Item, it left me with great pain in the mouth, which lasted 36 days, so that I could only eat bread, and the pain and sores went away after 14 days. But there remained a great pain in my mouth, and then on the 22nd of July, I suffered from a flux, from which I nearly died. And then the month of November, the really terrible pains returned in the arm and in my legs." As you gather, these passages give a vivid description of the symptoms of the malfrancesi provided by the patient himself, rather than is so often the case by a doctor. Moreover, he chose to include these personal details within the framework of his chronicle, The City of Orvieto, which may not have been a public document, at least had pretensions to record public events, and has become one of the main sources by historians studying the history of the city in this period. Ser Tommaso was fortunate because he lived another 20 years, but he recorded the names of some of his contemporaries who did die of malfrancesi over the next few years. Ser Tommaso's symptoms have much in common with those of other contemporaries. In the first attack, he suffered from pains on his left shoulder, kidneys, and buttocks. The second episode was more developed and was characterized by pains which spread to his arms and knees and eventually his mouth, as well as his genitalia. A contemporary chronicler of Perugia, Francesco Matarazzo, observed that the pain induced some to commit suicide. Quote, "Many men through desperation went to drown themselves in the river." In addition, there were external signs of scabs on his head and boils all over his torso. Treatment appears to have been partly self-administered and partly given by others, including a friar, and that consisted of bloodletting and medicines made up of a hot fermentation of a series of herbs, many known for their cooling qualities to counter the heat generated by the disease. Now, in this account, it's striking that Ser Tommaso, in common with many contemporaries during the early stages of this new disease, recorded his own sufferings as certainly uncomfortable, but doesn't mention how it was contracted, even if one of the symptoms was a pain in his rod. In the 1490s, there was no general acceptance of a close link between the sickness and sexual transmission, and the 2 prostitutes whom he recorded as having died in Perugia in these years perished apparently from other diseases. Of course, Ser Tommaso's coyness in not mentioning how he contracted the Great Pox may be linked to wanting to maintain his reputation as a canon in the cathedral, and a public figure, but also reflects belief in a wider theory of transmission in the early stages of the epidemic, as reflected in the comments by the Bolognese chronicler Friano degli Ubardini that, quote, it's passed on through eating, through drinking, and through sexual relations. The experience of patients who suffered from the Great Pox in early modern Europe has become the focus in recent years of a series of studies in countries both north and south of the Alps, from Santiago to Venice to Nuremberg, Frankfurt to London. Many of these studies have interrogated the records of hospitals which treated this disease. Indeed, Renaissance Italy was among the first to establish large specialized institutions known as the incurabili in some of the major cities of the peninsula, where literally thousands of people were treated every year, as in Rome. Although this is an interesting topic in itself, and indeed it's a subject I've worked on in the past, the incurabili will, as you see, only enter my story tangentially. Instead, my aim today is to examine how contemporaries experienced and imagined the Great Pox, and how these themes were reflected in literature and art through the medical gaze. In other words, I'm seeking to understand how far writers' and artists' literary and visual depictions can be further illuminated through viewing them through contemporary medical understanding of the disease. While many of the satirical plays and poems I'll examine are well known to historians, through viewing, little has been written on the iconography of the pox, in contrast to the numerous studies of plague in this period. So in order to explore these themes, my paper today will begin by examining satirical literature reflecting society's views of the pox in Renaissance Italy. There were two main types. The first were usually short plays performed in city streets and sold as cheap pamphlets. They usually centered around the life and decline of courtesans, framed within the context of contemporary views, the association between sexual activity and immorality. These leaflets were often accompanied by crude woodcuts, which link both to the wider genre of broadsheets and my theme of how pox was represented. The second main type were poems and plays, also printed and performed or read aloud within the context of literary academies. They mainly described the male patient as sufferer and provided details of the symptoms and progress of the disease itself. This leads then to the patient's view, which I shall discuss briefly in relation to another type of literary production, namely the autobiography of the goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini. This will then provide the context for my second main theme, the visual representation of the Great Pox. I will already have begun to explore this through the woodcuts accompanying popular pamphlets. But in the first, I shall also address two further types of visual sources, which have yet to be examined comprehensively. First, I'll mention briefly images of Saint Job, or San Giobbe, the patron saint of the Great Pox, but discuss in more detail medical illustration, and in particular, a relatively little-known, later 16th century album of watercolors from Perugia, showing the treatment and experience of patients. As we will see, these visual sources were distinguished from those contained in pamphlets and broadsheets, since they remain surprisingly devoid of the same moral character, underlining the importance of remaining sensitive to the function and purpose of each site of production. The Purgatorio degli Cortigiani di Roma, the Purgatory of the Courtesans of Rome, was written by Maestro Andrea Veneziano, a painter and poet at the papal court. The poem, which is well known, was written in the first person and recited by the author. It was designed to be performed during Carnival in 1525. It was followed by a short sequel, Il Lamento, The Lament, most probably written by the author's friend Pietro Aretino. Both were well known for writing satirical verse, which in this case is said to have built on the tradition of songs performed during Carnival, in which courtesans were portrayed either in a very positive, idealized fashion or in a very negative way. They shared a mixture of cruelty, moralizing, and the burlesque, pointing to the influence of this Florentine tradition on the Purgatorio. More broadly, it forms part of a genre of misogynistic burlesque poetry of the 16th century, often associated with literary academies in cities like Florence, Rome, and Siena. While the Purgatorio may be a satire, it also hid a more serious message of warning, both to prostitutes and their prospective clients, of the dangers to their health and fortune. The courtesan was warned, quote, not to trust in your beauty, that is fragile and brief like smoke and wind. For if you are now young and beautiful and clean, In old age, you will be dressed in every misery, and it will end up with the Great Pox in the new purgatory of the hospital of San Giacomo degli Incurabili in Rome. And here you see an image of the facade of the church, which was built in the late 16th century. The event then was staged on the 10th of February, 1525, in front of a large crowd near the river Tiber, and in the presence of his patron, Pope Clement VII, in his court. One of the more dramatic features of the occasion was described in an anonymous letter written to the Florentine politician Paolo Vittori, who was based at Civitavecchia on the coast north of Rome. Quote, "Yesterday, Maestro Andrea the painter made a cart on which were papier-mâché effigies of all the old courtesans of Rome, each one labelled with her name, and he threw the whole lot of them into the river in the presence of the Pope. I've sent to Orstolina, the courtesan, the sonnet and poem which were recited. Tomorrow the courtesans, to revenge themselves, beat the Maestro Andrea through the streets of Rome." Though there was no more detail concerning the appearance of the effigies, they probably mirrored the description in the poem of the effects of poverty, disease on the appearance of older prostitutes, and by identifying them would have further damaged their reputation. But this episode also underlines the agency of the courtesans themselves, as emphasized in recent literature on prostitutes in this period, but they were not as powerless to demonstrate their outrage. One should also remember that all these events took place during Carnival, which traditionally provided a brief period when people could protest within the safety valve of the world turned upside down. If the representation of the appearance of the aged courtesan on the cart and during the recitation was designed as a warning of the ultimate fate of any woman who became a prostitute, a major focus of the poem was the hospital of San Giacomo degli Incurabili. It was described as a living purgatory, where patients did penance for their sins through the sufferings of their diseased bodies. Andrea, in fact, spends some time describing the nature of patients' illnesses. This was the place to see, quote, "fearful monsters destroyed by their illnesses, which included leprosy, cancers, and universal sicknesses, which eat away the flesh as far as the bone." But Maestro Andrea's main interest was, in fact, malfrancesi, and the symptoms he described correspond quite closely with those described by contemporaries in both medical and non-medical texts. They include pains, boils, and sores, which spread from head to foot and led to the flesh being eaten away and patients losing their features, including, quote, "the face, the eyes, and chest, and ruined members, which meant they're no longer recognizable." This bodily decay caused pus and stench and led to the corruption of the air associated with the spread of disease. This description, though literary, coincides in general terms with that contained in the 1546 treatise by Girolamo Fracastoro de Contagione, which became a classic work on the subject. He provides one of the most detailed descriptions of malfrancesi and its symptoms. He began by describing how during the very early stages of the illness, when it hadn't fully erupted, the patient became melancholy and was generally characterized by lack of energy and a pale complexion. Next, the sores developed into ulcers on the sexual organs, which then spread to different parts of the body. These in turn developed into pustules, which took many forms, and I quote, "On some patients, they're small and rather dry, on others larger and fatter. Again, on some, they're livid, on others whitish and turning pale, or in some cases, harder and reddish." So with this medical guide in mind, let's begin to examine the way that Great Pox was imagined in visual terms. A further graphic representation of the later stages of the disease is shown in this crude woodcut on the title page. It shows a courtesan being wheeled along in a handcart after a limb's been attacked and weakened by the disease. We can see the ulcerated abscesses on her limbs, which evidently smelt since they attracted flies, which she attempts to whisk away with a twig. Handcarts of various types were commonly used to enable crippled men and women to travel around the city, as can be seen from the incised marble plaque on the wall beside the entrance door to the hospital church of Santa Maria in Porto Paradisi in San Giacomo in Rome. He, as you see, is scantily dressed, and he too, like the courtesan, is wearing a covering for his head to hide his baldness, and his right hand foot may be reduced to a stump by the illness. He's sitting in his cart with his hands joined in supplication, begging for himself and the hospital behind him. We have then two representations of pox patients, the first in the Purgatorio, showing round ulcers on her limbs, and the second of the male beggar. He's curiously shown without ulcers, but his illness is indicated by a bandage on his right leg and the cap covering his head, while the more advanced nature of his illness is indicated by his lameness. Indeed, the connection between pox and mutilated limbs was well known at the times described in Leo X's bull, which established San Giacomo as an incurable hospital in 1515. And I quote, "Thus, he said, poor people who are afflicted with an incurable disease are obliged to seek for food through the city for the whole day, sometimes dragging themselves along on little trolleys and vehicles, giving offence to themselves and blocking the way of those whom they encounter." The topic of the connection between the French disease and immoral actions remains a constant theme of popular literature and image well beyond early modern Italy, most famously in William Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, a series of paintings and prints from the 1730s. But this narrative genre was already well established in Italy by the late 16th century, and it's been argued formed the inspiration for Hogarth. The broadsheet attributed to Paolo Tozzi, The Lament of the Courtesan Anzola of about 1600, shows both her moral and physical decline. Here we see the sad story of a courtesan who, quote, "in the flower of my life, had been courted by gentlemen on bended knees, who sang her ballads and songs, caressed her, and gave her splendid food to eat, but which all ended in tears and laments." These series of scenes reflect the remorseless turning of the wheel of fortune, as she accepts gifts and flowers from her lovers, who, though smiling, are clearly carrying the malfrancese. After succumbing to the embraces of one of her lovers as they lie together in the sand dunes, she begins a downward spiral, her life reduced to misery and beggary, while her ex-lovers pass on the other side of the road, holding their noses to prevent smelling the rot of her disease. She ends up in hospital, in the top right-hand corner, surrounded by chamber pots and urinals, where she eventually dies. Once again, as in the Purgatorio, the representation of pox victims was fairly stereotypical. Anzola is shown walking with crutches after her encounter with her lover on the dunes, later lying down on her side, and then in the hospital. In each case, she is shown with the ulcerated pustules of the disease. These then are deliberately didactic tales imbued with a counter-Reformation morality. They represent a stark warning to women of the perils of prostitution as part of the Church's post-Tridentine campaign to save the souls of the fallen and prevent potentially vulnerable girls from entering the profession. Both these texts were part of a wider satirical and misogynistic literature which aimed at highlight the evils associated with the social climbing of courtesans. They too reflect a warning of the necessity to avoid contact with locations of infections, whether brothels or diseased bodies. We've also seen the visual evidence reflects a very generalized representation of the symptoms of the pox. And I now want to turn to the second type of literature, that which reflected, or purported at least to reflect, the experience of male patients. There are a range of satirical writers who presented their poems and plays to the newly formed literary academies in 16th century Italy, often established as a welcome relief from the activities of the serious official academies. For example, the author of the Purgatorio discussed above, Maestro Andrea, probably also wrote an anonymous pamphlet called The Seven Pains of the French Disease. In this poem, Andrea recounts in detail each of the excruciating stages of the disease, from pains in the head, the pustules developing over in his face, the loss of hair on his head, so that he appeared, quote, like a featherless starling, for the loss of teeth, and the final stages as the gormata eat away at his bones. In each case is the pain which he stresses, and in the process develops a whole vocabulary to describe its effects, from cruel to atrocious. It's been suggested by Dominique Branca in his analysis of pox and pain in French literature at the time that this genre represented a form of poetic therapy in which the patient confronted and tamed the illness. It's far from clear whether Maestro Andrea's account is from his personal experience. The normal assumption is that this satirical poem is simply based on observation and possibly imitation. Indeed, his presence in Rome gave him occasion to encounter those with malfrancese, particularly given its prevalence among members of the papal court. One of Maestro Andrea's contemporaries in Rome was the Sienese Niccolò Campani, lo Stracchino, who recounted his 8-year battle with the French disease in his long poem called The Lamento di Strascino, and it's got an subtitle of The Sopra il mal incognito, so about the unknown disease, il quale si tratta la pazienza e l'impazienza, which deals with patience and impatience. The woodcut print on the frontispiece shows the sick room and sums up some of the main themes of the poem. The most arresting part of the image is the suffering nude man at the center of the composition. His whole body is covered with dark blotches, which represented the horrendous sores, pustules, and ulcers generated by the disease. He's shown leaning back on his pillow and looking at the medical practitioner. The latter carries around his waist a scroll, which is probably a urine chart, to help him diagnose the patient's condition. Indeed, the attendant closest to the bed is holding what looks like a urine flask. The other main form of diagnosis was represented by taking the pulse, which the doctor appears to be doing as he holds the patient's left arm. It's significant to contemporary understanding of the transmission of the Great Pox that the doctor and his attendants appear to be curious and slightly shocked by his appearance rather than frightened of catching it themselves, since they're all in quite close proximity to the bed. Behind the practitioners is an open window, probably to cleanse the air from the smell produced by the suppurating sores. There is, as you see, a very strong religious theme to the image. The devil is shown flying above the bed and showering the patient with the disease, which translates into the blotches all over his body. However, behind the bed, one also sees an image of Christ, who has the power not just to inflict disease as punishment, but also take it away. It's for this reason the poem is entitled Patience and Impatience, and we see these contradictory themes at play throughout the poem. However, before considering further visual evidence, I want to provide a brief discussion of an example of the personal experience of a patient who contracted malfrancese through his autobiographical account rather than through poetry. This is a well-known episode since it was written by the celebrated sculptor and goldsmith Cellini, whose life is presented in lively and often scurrilous fashion. This account of a personal experience dates from some 30 years later, for Cellini wrote his Vita from about 1558 onwards. However, it was based on a memory of his events in the early 1530s. He therefore wrote with hindsight, by which time the Great Pox had become very well established and treatments had gone through a number of phases, from mercury to fumigation and guaiacum. In addition to the many other challenges in his life, which was a constant theme in the Vita, including treachery, imprisonment, accusations of murder, includes an account of how he contracted the French disease and how it was treated and eventually cured. It's true indeed that I'd got this sickness, but I believe I caught it from that lovely young servant girl whom I was keeping when the house was robbed. The French disease, as it was called, remained dormant in me for over 4 months before it showed itself and broke out all over my body in one go. It wasn't like what one commonly observes, but covered my body with certain red blisters the size of quattrini. The doctors wouldn't call it the French disease, although I told them why I thought it was. I went on treating myself according to their methods, but derived no benefit. At last then I decided on taking the holy wood against the advice of the leading physicians in Rome, and I took it with the greatest discipline and absence that could be conceived. After a few days, I felt much better, with the result that after 50 days, I was cured and sound as a fish. So this description reflects the tone of much of Benvenuto's Vita, emphasizing his sense of being a victim of circumstances. In recounting how he became sick, he linked it to sexual transmission. He moreover provides a brief sketch of the course of the disease. Initially he records that it remained dormant in his system for 4 months. While this might suggest he caught it subsequently from another sexual partner, in fact, in Fracastori's discussion of the symptoms, he records, quote, "It didn't manifest itself at once, but remained latent for a certain time, often even for 4 months. When the symptoms did appear, they were in the form of swellings, vesicette, the size of farthings and rose-coloured, which he claims were not like, quote, what one normally observes, though probably they were a little different from the pustules described by Fracastoro. His awareness these painful swellings were not the same as though he'd seen in other cases suggests a familiarity with the symptoms. Indeed, it was this familiarity which convinced him that he, as the patient, knew better than the doctors, but they had disputed his diagnosis of the Great Pox. Then Cellini, though initially adopting the treatment they prescribed, rapidly rejected it. Instead, he took a course of guaiacum, which they threatened would kill him. but in fact made him feel better after a few days and cured him after 50 days. Guacum, or holy wood, which was seen at the time as a miraculous cure for pox and many other ailments, was a hardwood imported from the Americas, where it was believed the Great Pox had originated. It was cut up into small pieces and boiled and given a drink to induce sweating. Its popularity may also have stemmed from the fact that it had fewer side effects than mercury, which when drunk tended to corrode the patient's mouth and gullet. So this passage then reveals Cellini's sense of agency as a patient, rejecting the medical expert's diagnosis and treatment. And one should remember that his Vita was written with hindsight some 30 years later. It was clearly designed to underline his own expertise and experience, often reflected in the seriousness with which he followed the regime during the Holywood cure, quote, with scrupulous discipline and rules of abstinence. Cellini's attitude to malfrancesi reflects that of an educated layman. He had an understanding of a range of diseases and also very decided ideas about the best and most appropriate form of treatment and which practitioners he favored. An attitude then, which had been shown by a series of recent historians, may also reflect that of many of his contemporaries. So I want now to move, in the time that remains, to visual representations of the Great Pox, first within a religious context and then a medical context. Central to the religious themes was Saint Job, or Saint Giobbe, who was adopted as the patron saint of the Great Pox. There were a range of ways of representing him in the 16th century, from his suffering on the dunghill to his appearance as one of a series of penitential saints, the images of a diseased body. Saint Job had in earlier periods been associated with leprosy, another long drawn-out epidemic disease, leading to disfigurement of the patient's body. There are a number of characteristics which also made him a suitable candidate as a patron saint of the Great Pox. On the one hand, he demonstrated an extraordinary patience in the face of suffering. On the other hand, like Saint Sebastian, when he was first martyred, he survived and was cured. Furthermore, Job was associated with stink, one of the characteristics of those suffering from pox. This is well brought out in Gregory Martin's guidebook Roma Sancta of 1581, which records a scene in front of the hospital of San Giacomo degli Incurabili in Rome, and I quote, "Upon St. James's Day in July, when all the city visiteth this hospital, there are set forth in lively portraits Job with his sores upon the dunghill, his wife holding her nose for niceness, not abiding her husband's stinky, his three friends weeping and lamenting his case." This image that we see here by Raffaello Vanni reflects the traditional iconography of Job seated beside his wife and attended by his three friends who lament his unjust suffering. Now, I'm in the process of surveying a considerable amount of iconographic evidence of St. Job in early modern Italy, and just in the process really of collecting these images together into a database and analyzing them. But from the initial analysis I've done, it's possible to make a few broad generalizations. First, there was very evidently a resurgence of interest in representing St. Job from the late 15th century onwards. And then, secondly, as the 16th century progressed, there's an increasing emphasis on representing the sores and pustules of his body and his ever closer association with the malfrancesi. Thirdly, some of the most explicit portrayals of disease appeared in altarpieces and fresco cycles in chapels or churches commissioned by confraternities and hospitals. Now, having said this, one must also recognize that there did remain a variety of ways of representing Job with his physical or spiritual suffering, which required a greater or a less emphasis on his disease. And I'll just give you a few examples before turning to the final text, which is a series of watercolors of people suffering from the pox. The first is Domenico Panetti's Virgin and Child and Saints of 1505. This was commissioned by the confraternity of San Giobbe in Ferrara, whose chapel had been painted at the time with a fresco cycle of the life of the saint. Ferrara had been as closely associated with the Great Pox since the middle of the 1490s, when a public debate had taken place between medical experts at the Este court concerning the nature of the disease, necessary since the dukes themselves and people in the court had early on been afflicted with the symptoms, and therefore have the personal experience of its effects. Panetti's painting shows on the left-hand side a semi-clad saint with delicate pustules on his torso, as they do in the case of another altarpiece of the same time, also commissioned by the Confraternity by Panetti, which is now the Indianapolis Museum of Art. But in this altarpiece, the Virgin and Child, these marks are sufficiently pronounced to indicate its association with the pox, and may reflect one of the early stages of the disease as discussed by Fra Castoro, that is, small ulcers which developed into pustules, some of which he described as, quote, small and rather dry. While Panetti's painting shows a semi-clad saint with delicate pustules on his torso, a less delicate representation of the illumination to the papal privilege of 1525 of the Incurabili Hospital dei Guarini di San Giobbe in Bologna. Job, as you see, is represented here on the left-hand side. In fact, there's another image of him on the right-hand side of Mary, the Madonna of Mercy, who spreads out her blue mantle to protect the members of the flagellant confraternity, which had actually established the hospital. While Job himself is outside the range of her cloak, he extends his left hand towards the flagellants, recommending them to Mary for their service. What obviously is particularly striking for our theme are the red sores or ulcerated pustules, which almost decorate the whole of his body, including his face, his arms, and his legs. These livid pustules reflected Fra Castoro's description of later symptoms of the disease and may also refer back to the longer iconographic tradition of leprosy. Now, I want to turn in the time that remains to consider images associated with contemporary medical contexts. Given the inclusion of detailed visual symptomology in later 18th century medical texts, one might have imagined that similar types of sources in the 16th century would have shown similar illustrations. However, the well-known treatises by, for example, Niccolò Massaro and Fra Castoro are without plates, even if they do provide considerable detail in their description of symptoms. The lack of illustrations to the 16th century medical treatise on the pox serves to make a little-known late 16th century album of watercolors in the Biblioteca Augusto in Perugia so remarkable. It contains 27 watercolors showing a series of individuals, the vast majority of whom were men, illustrating the symptoms of the pox in considerable detail. Little, unfortunately, is known about the album since it's anonymous and contains no text. So the rest of the last 10 minutes will represent a preliminary analysis of these images, concentrating on some of the main symptoms, a topic I'll be taking much further in my longer study. So this album, which has been known to a few specialists, has never been examined properly within a wider context, although it's not unreasonable to assume that it was produced to illustrate either a surgeon's treatise on the Great Pox or possibly to advertise the services produced by an Incurabili hospital treating the pox. Apart from the 27 watercolors and one undercolored drawing, the rest of the 99 folios were left blank, possibly waiting for the text to be supplied. There's no surviving information about the provenance of the album, although we do know that it formed part of the collection of the founder of the library, Prospero Podiani, when he gave his whole library to the commune of the Perugia in the late 16th century. We have a surviving inventory from the period. The manuscript itself also dates from that period, reflected in the style of the clothes, and it's probable that its origins were Central Italian, judging by the watermark of the paper of the album. A vivid and nuanced picture of the impact of the Great Pox on the human body and its treatment emerges from this album. These images show a wide range of individuals, from the young to the more mature, in contrast to those in the moralizing broadsheets, which concentrate mainly on the depictions of courtesans. Some in the initial stages of their illness were well dressed, in shirt, doublet, and trunk hose. Indeed, Christian Berko, in his study of early modern Toledo, has underlined a common perception at the time of the close association between young male libertines, such as Don Juan, and the spread of malfrancesi. The moralizing gaze thus regarded the contraction of the disease as a well-deserved punishment for their sinful activities. Other images trace the evolution of the disease through one patient, with their decadence reflected in their more ravaged appearance, as they gradually became more shabbily dressed as the illness got progressively worse, some ending up destitute on the street. Other examples were designed to represent a particular type of treatment. But what remains a particularly interesting and unusual feature of this collection of watercolors was their focus on the patient. And this final section provides a few preliminary ideas about the album. The variety of ulcers and pustules have been seen in the first watercolor of the collection of the bearded man with a series of red spots on his chest and legs. The man is very evidently suffering from infection of his skin, since he's undone his shirt and is shown scratching his chest and his left knee. The majority of the red marks on his skin are not that different from those depicted in some images of St. Job or the moralistic broadsheets about the decline of courtesans. But symptoms of the disease are represented in much greater detail. The body of this patient was characterized by a wider variety of pustules, such as the larger ulcerated areas of different colors on his right leg to the left knee. The choice of placing the image at the front of the album may reflect the intention of the compiler to show a patient who was not yet in a really advanced stage of the disease in comparison to some of the later, more shocking images. The larger infected area on the first patient's knee may also be what Fracastoro suggested was the increasingly significant feature of the symptoms of the pox, the gomata, larger and more insidious than pustules, exemplified also in the right-hand watercolor here, which shows a destitute youth, once a fashionable man about time who we see on the left, who still retains the feather in his hat. He wears a trunk hose, though he's removed his doublet and pulled down his shirt to reveal his diseased skin. He's clearly suffering from a more advanced stage of the disease. His chest and bare left arm reveals the pustules and deeper gomata of the pox, to which he points with the finger of his right hand. His very evident distress is reflected in his ragged clothes, and his left foot looks as though it's been eaten away by disease. In front of him on the ground is a clister pipe or bellows, suggesting a purgage treatment of an enema or sweating. The 19th watercolor shows a young man at a more advanced stage. He has red and black lesions on his arms and the lower part of his right leg, reflecting both the livid pustules and gomata. He's scantily dressed in a shirt with bandages covering his left leg and lower half of his torso, reflecting both the extent to which the disease had advanced and that he'd received treatment. The image also reflects the very real agony of the patient. For as mentioned by Fracastoro, one of the main symptoms of the pox was the violence of the pains which affected the muscles. They were, moreover, particularly severe at night, as reflected in this illustration of the young man who is literally crying out in agony with his arms spread out as he walks around his bedroom. Just as the courtesan was ultimately reduced to indigence by her disease, so were these male patients. As the disease eroded the bones, the sufferer became lame, as reflected in the 24th watercolor of a semi-bald man with a beard. He stands upright, supported by a crutch under his left arm and another under his left leg, which is bent at the knee. He wears a beige tunic and a red scarf over his left-hand shoulder. The left leg is shown covered in bandages, while the right is covered in lesions. His right arm and hand are extended in front of him, with the index finger pointing forward as though talking to or accosting somebody from whom he may be begging. His baldness is another symptom Fracastoro emphasizes. So far, the images discussed have been used to address principally the question of how sickness and symptoms were depicted. Treatment is the other theme which emerges from these watercolors, usually absent from the images of pox patients in other contexts. Contemporary treatment was both through internal and external medicine, which included herbal medicines, ointments, and the letting of blood. There was nothing revolutionary in this, and in De Contagione, Fracastoro underlines the importance of purging, both through taking evacuative pills and through bloodletting. He explains why this treatment was adopted. He defined the essence of the Great Pox as being phlegm, quote, which is dense and sordid and characterized by great viscosity. He also emphasized it was insufficient by itself, and more active medicines were needed to expel the phlegm, hence recommending the use of corrosive medicines such as mercury. This, he argued, should burn the, quote, the seeds of disease and convert the poisonous substance into sweat. It may very well be that this watercolor of the young man reflects the use of the bandages to cover up the ulcers treated with mercury ointment. The importance of sweating explains the frequent adoption of heat for the treatment of the Great Pox. In this scene, a patient is shown with bare feet seated on a stool in front of a fire. The turban he wears may be intended to avoid heat loss through his head or hide his loss of hair. The aim, as with much of the treatment of the pox, was to encourage sweating and to expel the corruption of the humours, which were regarded as the essence of the disease. This picture also shows a mug in front of the fire, which may very well be a reference to another treatment, drinking a solution of guaiacum. This was designed to purge the sick body from the corrupt matter of disease. Fracastori describes it, quote, as an almost divine gift. Because of the qualities, it is constituted by subtle parts and hot in the third degree and dry and finely resinous. It had the effect of drying with its heat, leading to sweating and attacking and purifying the phlegm, which caused the putrefaction and led to the onset of the disease. When none of these treatments worked, the doctor resorted to cauterization, as in the case of the young man being treated by a soldier with a helmet, possibly a surgeon working for the army. He applies a red-hot cautery iron to the sole of the right-hand foot of his patient, who's shown yelling in agony. A small brazier fire and bellows indicate the source of the heat. He's clearly in a more advanced stage of his disease. He has red lesions on his left hand, as well as his legs and feet, which are large enough to indicate that they've developed into gomata. The young man wears the reins of what were once smart clothes, a doublet and a shirt, underlining his social status. Despite treatment, the fate of these men was the same as that of Poranzola, in that many died in agony. These watercolors also reflect that treatment varied according to social and professional background. The more affluent could afford to be sick and die in their own beds. Others ended up begging in the street or treated in the crowded wards of an incurable hospital, a fate about which, as we've seen, Maestro Andrea warned the courtesans of Rome. So to conclude, this discussion of the various iconographic sources showing the symptoms of the Great Pox has shown that, in contrast to both traditional representations of St. Jove and to the broadsheets, the watercolors in the Perugian album are much more nuanced, where they show pustules, ulcers, gomata, and even the psychological effect of pain and the reactions of the patient. It's also evident that all the main elements of the treatment illustrated correspond to the recommendations of Fracastori and other contemporary medics at the time: sweating, purging, and the use of the holy wood. However, what is striking here and in Fracastori's treatment is the lack of a moralistic element, except perhaps in the case of the young man with a feather in his hat. This is in complete contrast to the ideas reflected in broadsheets and the carnivalesque plays mounted for popular delectation. We're thus dealing with representations of medical ideas and practice designed to guide the reader and viewer in treating this new disease. Moreover, unlike the other source, emphasis is placed on the patient and treatment, as we see from his reactions to the severe pains which afflicted his body and the agony of cauterization of the entrenched pustules and gomata. But to end on a more optimistic note, if that's possible, reflecting recent drugs for COVID, the aim of treatment was, after all, not just to allay symptoms, but also to cure them. And Fracastori recounts that some practitioners had good results using milder remedies, such as aromatic drugs like juniper wood, to expel the phlegm, seen as the cause, also helping to explain the popularity of guaiacum. But more generally, there is hope, because he tells us, quote, "This disease has now entered on its old age, and that the time is not far off when it will cease to propagate itself, even by contagion." Thank you very much.